Hello and welcome to the new episode of Space Defense and Security Podcast by XSUP. So we have actually covered several topics on space, especially the military satellites. But looking at the Asia's domain, the kind of movements that are happening in Asia right now, and especially looking at the big giant like SpaceX, we really haven't touched upon this topic in a much more depth. So the today's topic is going to be covered by some of the expert who is an expert in the Chinese market and in the Asian market very recently as well. So without any delay, I would like to welcome Mr. Blaine Curcio on the episode. Hi Blaine, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Omkar. It's been a little while. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, it's great to have you as well, Blaine. Again, I think we had previously recorded a lot of episodes, and I believe those received a lot of engagement. People were kind of asking me like what are the kind of movements that are happening in the Chinese market. Then I actually redirected them to your newsletter, which of course I'll add that newsletter link again in the description as well. So I hope you received a good amount of engagement for your newsletter as well, because a lot of people had several in-depth questions. So yeah, thank you very much for the kind of work that you're doing. I think very few experts are working on ground the way you are doing at the moment in Asia, that too, because I think Europe and the US market is anyways too much. The information is a lot out on the web, but the Asia market, the Chinese market, the information is very less, and the experts like you are contributing towards it. So yeah, thank you very much, for providing such information and the insights to all of us. Jumping into the today's topic, that is SpaceX Starlink expansion in Asia. Is that an opportunity, threat, or both? So from your perspective, is Asia entering a new military space race like countries like South Korea, Japan, India, maybe even Indonesia, and others are like accelerating investment in satellite communications, maybe it's Earth observation or defense side as well. So from complete your studies and the in-depth intelligence that you gather, are we witnessing the emergence of Asian military spaces, and how does it compare to the US-China competition at the moment?
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. So I think I'm sad to say that, yes, there does seem to be some kind of a military space race happening in Asia Pacific, but I would even frame it in a little bit of a broader context and say it's a kind of sovereign space race. So I think, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, as we get along, but I think the entrance of Starlink has caused a lot of countries to one recognize the power that you can that you have with space. I mean, to recognize that the impact that space can have on people. So Starlink has done a lot of good things in connecting people in remote areas in Asia Pacific and in connecting schools and government offices and so on. So it has made countries in Asia a bit more cognizant of what could really be possible with space development, while at the same time cause them a little bit of concern with regard to over reliance on a single company or on a single country. And so I think we've seen, to take an example, Indonesia over the last handful of years. Starlink
Yes.
they got market access in Indonesia a few years ago. Initially, they only had market access through PT Telkom, a state-owned telecommunications company, and their subsidiary Telkomsat. And then Starlink, through some seemingly fairly aggressive lobbying, they got direct market access into Indonesia. And so, what initially was a rather controlled entry through a single state-owned entity, it became much more of an unfettered entry of Starlink into the market. And so, again, in Indonesia, initially you saw remote places being connected and people were benefiting, and it was all well and fun. But,
Yeah.
before too long, the government had to start questioning, are we giving up too much sovereignty here? And I think that same thing has taken place across other places in Asia, to where now you have more countries that are aiming to develop their own sovereign capabilities. And to your point a moment ago, it's not limited to SATCOM. On the Earth observation side, we're seeing the same thing. So yesterday I was watching an interview with, I'll probably butcher his name, but I believe Eiichi-san, the CEO of Sky Perfect JSAT. This was an interview from Satellite a few months ago, from via Satellite, the news publication. And they were asking him about the deal that Sky Perfect JSAT had made with Planet to buy some Planet satellites that would be owned and operated by Sky Perfect JSAT. And the angle
Yes.
that Iichi-san was explaining this from is, you know, JSAT sees the opportunity in Earth observation, but they don't want to be squeezed as a middle person between, let's say, Planet and the Japanese government. They
Yes,
want to have greater control of their own destiny. And so I think that same narrative is playing out across large swaths of Asia Pacific. And I think, in particular, in the military context, um, it's become more front and center because the world is unfortunately becoming a more conflict ridden place. And it looks like that trend is going to
yeah,
continue. And so you've seen greater military budgets for space. You've seen in countries like Indonesia, the Ministry of Defense has become, let's say, more powerful relative to the Ministry of Telecommunications in the space domain. And so, yes, I think there's this push towards military space race, but also more broadly a sovereign space race in Asia Pacific.
absolutely. I believe that entry point of Indonesia that you mentioned, I think looking at India, because recently we came and saw that there is a bit of a friction that is happening in India as well with SpaceX. I think last year there was a lot of hype that they are being allowed to basically enter the market, sell their products and services. And now, very recently, we got to know through a lot of sources, of course, on the web, open sources, that there is a blockade that they are hitting right now because of the regulations. So, like, do you have any brief thoughts on that? I mean, we are discussing a lot on the Far East Asia, but yeah, just in general, if you have any thoughts on this case as well.
Sure. So I think India sits at a really interesting position. And maybe to tie it into the second part of your last question about how does this all compare to the US China competition, I think the US and China, and maybe to some extent the European Union, are at this point the three space powers that have what we could call, comprehensive national capabilities, for lack of a better term. The Chinese space industry and the US space industry, and to an extent the European space industry, they can build their own rockets, their own satellites, their own ground systems, etc.
Yes,
Most of the countries in Asia that I talked about a moment ago are not big enough and don't have enough engineers and just don't have necessarily the domestic capabilities to build everything themselves. And so they're going to have to partner with, again, in the instance of JSAT, you see them partnering with Planet. I think India has the combination of scale and skilled talent and economic size and budget and all of these things to where eventually you could imagine a rather comprehensive domestic Indian space ecosystem. And it may take, or I suppose it will take some time, and it will require some investment from, I'm sure, from the government and from private enterprises and so on. But I think that India is, I can fully understand the hesitance by India to just open the doors to foreign space companies, partly because you could imagine India could probably launch their own Starlink like constellation at some point. And I've seen in recent weeks some announcements from Reliance Geo on this very topic. But I think, again, India sits at that interesting intersection of, very big country, a lot of skilled engineers, fairly a big economy, and a real use case for satellite communications or for space more broadly, that could justify building out a fully domestic ecosystem.
interesting. And I mean, we are seeing that, the Starlink has become more kind of a disruptive force in the Asia space industry. So, as it is expanding aggressively across the region, has it fundamentally broken the traditional satellite business model in Asia? And can regional operators realistically compete with SpaceX? I'm asking this question because I remember last time when we spoke, you mentioned that the broadcasting business is still thriving in Asia. So, how does it basically go in Asia? Because a lot of countries are giving them entries, but at the same time, the broadcasting business also. Then I think SpaceX is not into broadcasting for sure; it's into broadband.
Right. So I think maybe on the broadcasting point first, and then can talk about the kind of whether or not Starlink has broken the traditional satcom business model. But I think the one thing that we've learned in broadcasting is it's quite a sticky industry in some ways, right? Like once somebody is subscribing to direct to home television, it takes a lot for them to cancel that service. And the two
Yes,
best examples, probably in Asia Pacific, would be Japan and South Korea, where you still have, albeit a declining, you still have a fairly large portion of households that subscribe to Sky Perfect TV and KT Skylife in Japan and South Korea, respectively.
Yes.
And these are obviously countries that have aging populations, and aging populations, all else equal, are going to be a bit more into the traditional broadcasting medium. And so I think we've learned that broadcast is quite sticky. And I think in other countries in Asia where broadband internet is not as well penetrated, even if it's a younger population, you will see for the foreseeable future, you'll see a decent subset of the population needing to use satellite to get broadcast. So I think that it is clearly an industry that's in some level of decline, but I think the decline has maybe been a little bit overstated or premature in some way. Now, getting to the second part of your question, I guess the first part of your question about whether Starlink has broken the
Yeah.
traditional satcom business model in Asia, I think that's probably a little bit of it's too strongly worded. I think that Starlink has certainly disrupted the industry in certain countries in Asia, but I think you've seen some service providers, like satcom service providers in these countries, make a very decent business of reselling Starlink services. And then I also think that the domestic operators themselves have found ways to pivot into other areas that are not as directly competing with Starlink. So to take a couple of examples, um, Miasat in Malaysia, and Malaysia being a very open market for Starlink, a lot of subscribers there, but Miasat is now getting more into satellite IoT, partly with some Chinese partners, but also just satellite IoT more generally. Um, and then you also have, in the case of Malaysia, but also elsewhere, government connectivity programs where there may be more of a requirement for local capacity or for local operator involvement. And a lot of these Asian satellite operators, they are relatively more financially conservative. So, for example, they don't take on huge amounts of debt in order to buy geo satellites, which makes them a little bit nimbler, right? So, like the obvious examples would be
Yes.
companies like AsiaSat and APT Satellite based in Hong Kong. For a very long time, they both had sort of unofficial and maybe even official policies of not taking on any debt at all. And so they would have very clean balance sheets. And yes, the satellites, you have to you have to sell them for 15 years. And yes, it's a hard business model, but
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to be flexible on price, to be choosy on your customer base if you have a very healthy balance sheet. Whereas some of these Western satellite operators have, rather heavy debt loads that require them to maintain a certain aggressive level of pricing on their capacity in order to pay down the debt on the satellite that was launched even a couple of years ago. And you think about, okay, what's that going to look like in 10 years? Like that may become a hard debt burden to bear in 10 years if capacity pricing keeps coming down and down and down. So I think it's definitely Starlink is definitely disrupting the satcom industry in Asia Pacific, but I don't think it's fundamentally broken.
Interesting. And looking at the governments across Asia, which are like suddenly prioritizing space sovereignty, is the push for sovereign satellite infrastructure driven primarily, I would say, by national security concern, economic independence, or just fears of dependent on foreign mega constellations? I mean, I think what we saw with the recent ongoing US-Iran war as well. I mean, not only in SATCOM but even in Earth observation side, that US restricting their commercial operators from selling imageries and all. So, do you think that kind of a situation is something that the Asian countries are predicting, which is why there is a race, not race, I would say, but a build up for sovereign satellite infrastructure that is coming up?
I think those all play a role. I think the other aspect here is optics, for lack of a better term. The fact that everyone around the world is seeing SpaceX and Starlink and saying, "Oh my God, it's so innovative! Like we need to have our own innovation like that." And for governments, you've seen multiple examples in Asia of governments that say we want to launch our own sovereign geocom satellite, for example, within our term that we have in a 4-year term and a 6-year term, whatever it is. And it's almost like the government giving back to the people in some way or having these national flag projects where they can say, oh, see, look at what we've been doing for our country's development and so on. So I think that's probably not the primary concern, but it is an additional concern, in addition to the points you mentioned about national security, economic independence, and fears of becoming dependent on foreign mega constellations. I think that these are all factors.
And I mean, just to add on to this question, I would say, uh, do you think it is manageable in terms of execution? I mean, just to, there might be a bit of a deflection over here on the topic that we are discussing, but I'm going more on the economics and the finance side and the execution side of the space industry and the SATCOM especially as well. A lot of people, when they ask me, being an Indian coming originally from India now, based in Europe for past 10 years, uh, I see Indian sector, everything is great. But when I see some people comparing it with China, I do not see that level of discipline and execution being going into the place the way China has. And which is why a lot of things are lagging in the country. Like, firstly, coming to the manufacturing. Uh, India has the capacity, but I think the lack of discipline and execution is something that is not letting the things take off the way it needs to be. Even though the government has a lot of resources, but I think the current, I would say, a pipeline of the people that is there, it's not developed to that level. It might take some years to reach. Similarly, when I see related to the space infrastructure, I mean, Europe, if we see on a much more broader scale, has executed some of the far more complex missions than NASA, but the world doesn't know it, like Rosetta. So there is a communication gap, there is an execution gap, and of course, there is a bit of a slow, I would say, pace due to the bureaucracy. Like, when I myself, for example, when I work with the US companies, the kind of agility and the flexibility I experience is something that I do not experience with anyone else in the world, whether it's a European company, whether it's an Indian, or whether it's anyone else. I do not experience that kind of agility when it comes to, operations, executions, maybe taking the decisions, maybe adjusting to certain conditions. So I think the US ecosystem is made in such a way that it makes the execution process easier, both from a bureaucracy, both from, I would say, ecosystem development and the resource management perspective. But do you think, is it manageable for other parts of the, because SpaceX is a huge thing. I mean, everyone is trying to, I think Rocket Lab, we are seeing they're trying to develop a similar kind of ecosystem now, complete vertical integration. But again, can anyone pull off the cards the way SpaceX have done? Because I think there's a lot of nitty gritty level management and execution and the discipline that has gone into it. Europe has been trying to develop its own ecosystem, but I think currently things are scattered all across. Today, if I tell anyone to look at the US market, I have a very straightforward perspective. There is Space Development Agency under which the contracts are deployed. There is SBR, STTR programs. But I think when you come to Europe, there is GovSatcom, there is USPA, there are like 1,000 different programs, but not a set standard where anyone can easily execute things. So I think this is an issue from my perspective. What do you think? Like, when I look at this, I always see that, okay, people might give it a shot to develop a sovereign satellite capabilities, but I don't think so it can be taken up to the level the SpaceX has done, because a lot of nitty gritty level management has gone into the management of the resources and the complete discipline of the business. So, what are your thoughts in general? I mean, like, this is just my thought, keeping all the national security and anything aside. I think that it's a very tough to manage, but SpaceX has cracked the code to execute that plan.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it's. I mean, it is hard to imagine any individual company in Asia being able to pull off what SpaceX has done right, up until now. That being said, I mean, when you look at the size of some of these companies in South Korea, take an example. Samsung Electronics, their revenues last year were like 250 billion US dollars, and like South Korea's, the whole economy is like $2 trillion. Like Japan, $4 trillion economy. Like these are big. These countries are big enough
Yeah.
to where a 10 or 15 or $20 billion constellation would not bankrupt any of these countries, and in some cases, even companies like Samsung Electronics. I'm sure if they really, really wanted to, and if there was really a business case, they could afford the R&D that would be involved in building out a Starlink-like constellation. I think that
Yeah.
the challenge, and this is where you have to give credit to SpaceX to some extent, is they were willing to take a pretty enormous risk, because remember, I mean, up
Yes.
until 2020, the satellite internet business was globally was not nearly big enough to support that size constellation. And it might still not be, like, it's still not completely clear how really profitable Starlink is, although it seems like they are in fact profitable. But SpaceX and Starlink had to take the risk of saying, we believe that building this will grow the existing market for this service by a factor of 7x, or however much they've grown the global satellite internet business by up until today. And I think that's where most, even a Samsung Electronics, they're not designed to take that size risk, I don't think. Now, you can imagine in the future, if, let's say, satellite directed device becomes a lot more well established. Samsung sells almost as many smartphones as anyone, maybe more smartphones than anyone. I don't have the numbers in
Yeah.
front of me, but um, if it becomes abundantly clear to the leadership at Samsung that there will come a day when most cell phones are connecting directly to satellites, and Samsung is selling all these smartphones, then it would seem like a much easier risk to take. And then the only question is, would they do it quickly enough, and would they operate and execute efficiently enough to actually make that feasible? And I think if we look at some of these companies in Korea and Japan and Taiwan, um, and the way they've executed with other very complicated technologies, I don't think there's anything really magic about what Starlink and SpaceX have done. Like, I don't think it's something that the smartest engineers in Korea or Japan or Taiwan or India could not figure out. Um, and so then it just becomes a question of being willing to take that huge risk, and take the plunge, and organize teams such that you can actually build these projects out. But I think the
Yeah.
short answer would be, the secret sauce that SpaceX has had up until now is just an incredible degree of risk taking, and a kind of willingness to say, yeah, this market doesn't actually exist right now, or the market is not nearly big enough to justify this. But if we do this thing right, we will grow the market many times over. And I mean, you could argue, for example, maybe Apple with the iPhone was a bit similar, where people were thinking, "Oh, nobody will ever want to have a phone where the whole screen, the screen is all the keyboards on the
Yeah.
screen, and it's all." Um, but for them, they said, "Well, this could work, and if we execute on it, it becomes a $1 trillion market." And who could have seen that coming? But
Yes.
I think that's the secret sauce, is having the audacity to say, we're going to invest all of this money into a technology and a product that is still far off in the future, let's say.
That's a nice perspective as well. And just going a little bit deep inside into the global giants. So, will the future of Asia's space market be dominated by only a handful of players, especially like Starlink, Amazon Leo, or maybe even Chinese constellations? Because I think China is utilizing its international relations to basically expand its satellite services all across. I think what we saw in Africa as well in the last decade. Uh, are these local Asian space companies destined to become like acquisition targets, or can maybe even national champions survive and thrive independently? Because as far as I see, even in India, what is happening is right now there are players like Reliance that are entering into the market of the. I mean, last week only on Friday, I think they announced the plans officially that they are launching satellite constellation, and I think the regulation files and everything have been already submitted as well, as per whatever the sources that I received insights from. So these companies are of course not going to build everything from scratch. They are going to acquire things in the market, and I think Reliance has tried to basically invest in some of the space companies already. So will we see a kind of a similar trend down the line, where Amazon Leo, SpaceX might basically try to acquire the existing businesses in the countries that they're targeting?
So yeah, I mean, I think there's only a small number of companies in the world that could really compete with Starlink in terms of just size and ambitions, and again, like the tens of billions of dollars of R&D and capex that you would need to be spending in order to build a constellation like that. And I think the number of such companies in Asia outside of China, let's say, is a few. I mean, there's not 50 of them. There's probably 10 or less. That being said, I mean, yeah, to your point a moment ago, Reliance Geo, it's a very interesting announcement, and Reliance would be one of the relatively few companies that would have the scale to do that. As I mentioned
Yes.
earlier, companies like Samsung Electronics are certainly big enough to do this if they decided they wanted to do it. I've been hearing other interesting rumblings from other really big companies in South Korea about wanting to get into launch and constellations and this kind of thing. But I still think, and this is a topic I don't think we've touched on yet, but I think it's an important topic. Um, there there ought to be, and I hope in the future there will be, appetite for a sort of pan-Asian LEO constellation where different countries, almost like like a federation or like kind of like an ESA budget kind of thing, where countries pay money in and then the money gets paid back out to contractors in those countries, and you have multiple countries banding together to build their own sovereign constellation. Because I think if that does not happen, then yeah, there would be a risk of the entire satcom market in the region eventually just being eaten up by Starlink and Amazon Leo and the Chinese constellations. Um, because at the end of the day, when you look at the bandwidth economics of some of these Starlink satellites being launched, I mean, it's unbelievable. It is very hard to imagine, um, legacy geo satellites competing with that. And in some ways, it's even hard to imagine some of these new, fully software defined geo satellites, or these small geos that are talking about hundreds of gigabits per second. Like the numbers just don't really add up when you compare it to a single,
Yeah.
Starlink is launching multiple terabits per second at a time on each of their Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets. Like it's an unbelievable amount of bandwidth. And so I think unless you get a concentrated effort in the region to develop a comparable capability of, let's say, capex dollars per gigabit per second or something like that, it's just going to be really hard to compete in terms of price.
Yeah. And moving ahead a little bit on the kind of a little bit of on the same part, which countries are quietly emerging as Asia's next major space power? Like beyond China, I mean, you're a China expert, so beyond China, India, and Japan, which are the nations that are making strategic moves that the global space industry is possibly underestimating today? I used to think, it might be coming up next, might be Philippines and South Korea, of course, because Washington actually, I think they completely removed the defense regulations that they had, because of which they were not able to develop the space technologies at a larger scale. It happened, I think, in 2024 or 2023 back then. And since then, I think things have been very much expanding in South Korea. So, from my perspective, I was thinking Philippines and South Korea might be the case, but yeah, I would like to hear your perspective, because I think you are on the ground over there 24/7 in this market. So, yeah, please feel free to let us know.
Sure. So I definitely, and I'm a little bit biased being here in Seoul, but I think South Korea is doing some interesting things. In
Yeah.
particular, again, they have a lot of commercial space companies that have been founded just in the last 5-10 years, and I mean more and more being founded every year. It seems like I was at this ISS conference in Daejeon last week, and you had a startup corner where it was all like really smart, well-educated engineers and researchers with PhDs from like KAIST, the sort of MIT of Korea, trying to do specific things in the space sector. So that was really cool to see. But then you also have these huge technology giants that have the money and the engineers and just the general technical know-how of how to execute on big ambitious projects. So I think South Korea is interesting. And the other thing with South Korea is the newish government of Lee Jae-myung is very pro AI, pro automation. There's a lot of interest in on orbit AI, on orbit data centers, computing, this kind of thing. And I think it is a very tech savvy country, and it's a country that, for demographic reasons and for just kind of general reasons, but I think especially demographic reasons, it's not particularly concerned about AI leading to job losses, because there's just, the population is going to be declining here relatively soon, and so there needs to be AI that actually makes people more efficient. And so I think being able to adopt those technologies is going to be an important enabler here. I think other countries that are quietly emerging, let's say, Indonesia, I mean, they've always been a kind of under the radar space power. Like, not, a lot of people don't realize that the first Asian geocommunications satellite was launched 50 years ago this year by Indonesia, the Palapa series of satellites. So they've always had SATCOM, but now the Indonesian government is quite keen on tech transfer, on building things domestically. And so there's now quite a lot of interest in Indonesia in building satellites there, or at least integrating satellites there, potentially building optical payloads there for some optical remote sensing satellites. I was at a conference in Jakarta last month, and PSN, which is one of the leading domestic satellite operators in Indonesia, geo satellites, they were saying, their CEO was saying that they recently launched a handful of LEO IoT test satellites, as an example. So I think Indonesia has a lot of potential, and it's a huge country. It has like almost 300 million people and a lot of good engineers, a lot of good researchers. So that would be another one. Um, Philippines is similar. I mean, it's a big country, more than 100 million people, and a long history of SATCOM. Um, One challenge in the Philippines is that politically it tends to be a little bit cyclical. So you'll have a new administration come in, and the
Yeah.
old administration becomes kind of less. The priorities of the old administration become less important, partly out of spite, I think, from the new administration. But Philippines definitely has a lot of interesting fundamentals. And then you have countries like Australia, New Zealand, that I think are going to play an important role in their own niches. I think that's one of the things that's always impressed me about the Australian space industry and the space agency there is, they've been saying for years that we don't want to do every single thing in space. We want to look at what characteristics does Australia have, what advantages does Australia have, and how can we use space in the context of those advantages, rather than trying to do all things for all people. And I think that's a very pragmatic way of approaching the space sector, and I think that they have a good chance of having an important, let's say, a niche role in the Asian space sector. So I think those are probably some of the few that seem most interesting.
Yeah. That I think that's a nice perspective actually. And I think we are at the final stage of this episode. Uh, so I'd like to ask you from, I mean, your perspective. You have been like attending a lot of events. You have been like panelist as well for a lot of conferences. So looking ahead to possibly 2035, what will this Asian space industry look like in terms of who will control the region's communication infrastructure, EO networks, is Earth observation, and the most importantly, military space capabilities, and what developments today will determine the winners, losers of that in the future? Because I believe, from the security perspective, especially, there are a lot of conflicts I feel that might be coming up. I mean, like, of course, military space was not the focus in our episode, but looking at the kind of recent movements that we are seeing in Asia, especially because of the kind of things that are happening in the Middle East right now, that there is a possibility that Asia might experience such level of situations in the future. So, considering everything, what are your thoughts on this? Like, where do we see this Asian space industry evolve, and where is it going in the future?
So I think to take this question apart a little bit, I think on the Earth observation side, it's going to be easier for countries to have some level of sovereignty, because you can launch a relatively small number of sophisticated EO satellites and have your own network to a certain extent. And so I would expect quite a few Asian countries will have their own Earth observation satellite constellations, whether it's a handful or whether it's 100
Yeah.
satellites. But I think we're seeing early stages of that again with JSAT and Planet, and with the Indonesians trying to build their own, that kind of thing. I think on the telecommunication side, it's a little bit more complicated, and I could imagine like three distinct scenarios, maybe four. So I think at the very far end of the spectrum would be something like Asia develops their own Pan-Asian non-geo constellation, and that serves as a regional competitor to Starlink and to Amazon and to the Chinese constellations, and they have that sovereignty and they have that domestic capability. I think the next sort of somewhat less sovereign outcome would be these small geo satellites start to really pick up momentum, and it becomes possible to buy hundreds of gigabits per second or even a terabit per second in geo and have that as a domestic capability. And so you could imagine, a country the size of, say, South Korea, or maybe a bigger one like Japan or Australia, having one or more small geo satellites that are domestically controlled, and there's a fully domestically owned network, and they have some level of
Yes.
sovereignty in the geo side, but then for non-geo, they're largely reliant on Starlink or Amazon or others. But there's this kind of blend of domestic versus international capacity and coverage and capabilities. And then I think the least sovereign option would be something like, the small geo companies don't end up being able to deliver on their promises, and geo remains relatively expensive and clunky, and with long lead times and very customized, exquisitely built geo satellites, and it becomes harder and harder for companies to justify buying them. And at the same time, the big non-geo constellations just kind of take over the satcom sector, and that's kind of a, maybe not terrifying, but it's certainly not an optimal proposition if you're an Asian country and you just have no sovereign geo assets, no sovereign NGSO assets, and you're almost entirely reliant on Starlink or Amazon or the Chinese constellations. But I mean that could happen if you get again, if all the geo manufacturers are if all the promises that they've been making do not come to fruition, and if there's not a really like concentrated domestic effort to develop an Asian non-geo constellation. And then the last piece on military space capabilities, I think we may see some kind of we are probably going to see some kind of a fracturing of the region, where you have countries like South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Australia buying a lot of Western and probably mostly US hardware, similar to the way that these countries, they don't, most of them don't build their own fighter jets, right? Or at least they buy many US fighter jets in addition to maybe some of their own fighter jets.
Yes.
Um, you could imagine some military space infrastructure being built domestically. Like, I was reading an article yesterday about how Japan has developed this new what kind of a warship? The Megumi class, I think it is. Um, what is it? I'm kind of curious now. It is a Mogami. I'm sorry, the Mogami class
Mogami. Okay.
frigate. Yes, the warship, which apparently has been very well received by Australia, among other places. And then you could imagine maybe Japan will find a niche in space of like, oh, we have the great optical technology, and we're going to build the most high resolution optical military
Yes.
remote sensing constellation, something like that. But I could certainly imagine a lot of countries in Asia kind of falling towards the Western side, but then as we've seen in places like Pakistan, like they've bought a lot of Chinese military equipment on the ground and in the air.
Yes.
And I could certainly imagine them buying a lot of Chinese military space equipment. And I think there's a lot of other countries in the region that would tend to lean that way as well. And then you may see some countries like Indonesia, for example. One thing we didn't really talk about is that Indonesia, in addition to wanting to do their own thing in space, they are recognizing that they are a big enough country to where they can balance US, China, Europe, and to a certain extent, even Russia. And they're buying stuff from everyone. And so maybe there will
Yes.
be some countries that say, We don't want to become too reliant on any one partner, and we have a big enough population and we have enough to offer that we can stay balanced. But yeah, I
Yes.
think you're going to see a lot of that kind of development in the Asian space sector moving forward.
That's very insightful. I think you provided a lot of insights, especially in the last question as well. So, really thankful to you, Blaine, for providing us such great insights. And especially, I know you're quite busy with the travel and everything. I think summers are coming up here as well. In Europe, it's starting, so I think things are wrapping up for a lot of companies too. So, thanks for taking out time and providing us great insights. I hope to record more such episodes with you in the future. And yes, I think as usual, a lot of our audience is always interested to hear an in-depth perspective from you. So I'll add the LinkedIn and as well as the newsletter link in our description section. So in case, Blaine, if you have any more other materials as well that you are publishing anywhere else, just let us know. I'll add it in the description section as well.
Sure thing. No, I'm just
Yeah,
yeah, happy to connect with any of your listeners. You can find me on LinkedIn at the hashtag China Space Guy. But otherwise, yeah, thank
yeah.
you, Omkar, for the invitation. It's always good to catch up.
Same here. Thank you very much, Blaine.
Cool. Thanks. Talk to you later.